Part of being able to fix your knits involves being able to take out your stitches and rows in a way that is quite controlled, but yet gets you back to the error. The first method that we're going to look at is called tinking, which is knitting backwards, quite literally. And it's used for when you are going to go back a short distance, so maybe within the row or a couple of rows. It's also used when you're taking out a very complex stitch that you don't want to take all of your stitches off the needle. Your stitches, you insert the tip of your left needle from front to back of the stitch that you're taking out, and then you take out the stitch. So you put it in, secure it on your left needle, and then using your tail yarn pull it out. Now don't put it in from back to front, because as you have seen there, it reverses the stitches and it means they're not mounted correctly. So now I'm at the stitch where I want to correct, and I'm now ready to knit forward again. So that's a very controlled way of taking your stitches out of your knitting and correcting them and then knitting back along your row. The next method of pulling back your knitting is not quite as controlled. It's called frogging, and the reason we call it that is because you rip it and this is for use for taking out much larger parts of a project. Take the knitting out to below the error that you're going to fix, and then you need to put your stitches back onto your needle to continue working, and we'll look at that in just a second. With your piece of knitting, what I recommend doing is that the first thing that you want to do is just get your stitches onto your needle, and I will just put them on in any way that I can, and then I will go in the direction that I'm pulling the needle out. So I'm going to be pulling out my stitches as I go here, so pulling them out more, and then I'm just putting them all onto my needle again. And the reason that I'm doing this is that it's just you want to get those stitches secured as quickly as possible and not worry too much about how they're mounted on the needle. You're going to worry about that in the next row. Now you have two options here. You can either work the row, or you could tink back one more row to make sure that it's right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually purl this row. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if that stitch has been properly pulled out, and it hasn't. So make sure when you're picking up stitches that your edge stitches are actually just one stitch, so that you're not doubling them up by mistake. And again, that's all about the structure of the knitting, so you can check those bumps to make sure that it's correct. The next thing I'm going to knit, I'm going to purl that stitch because it's a purl row. Now as I come here, you will see straight away that this stitch is not correct because my leading leg is behind, so my right leg is behind, and I need to have that at the front so I can purl it. And then I correct them all as I go. Now again, you could tink back and correct all of those stitches before you start working, but to be honest, it doesn't make a huge difference unless you have a very complicated piece, in which case you might frog back quite a bit, put the yarn back onto your needles, and then tink out a couple of extra rows to make sure that that the stitch pattern that you're following or something like that is correct and complete. And so you'll often combine both methods. The reason, and I'm going to show you here, that you have to be very careful when you're mounting your stitches is that if you do them incorrectly, when you turn over your work, you will see that those stitches are now twisted. So the first few are correct, so their columns are right, but you will see that they're twisted. So two of the key things that when you're ripping back your work, like frogging it, you make sure you mount your stitches correctly, and then you make sure that you've actually covered the error and kept any stitch pattern correct. So those are just two things to watch for when you're frogging. Now I'm going to tink back, untwist those stitches, and then I'm going to fix them properly. That's it. That's how you rip out your knitting, and they are two very key skills that you will use more than you want to, I imagine.